The spotlight finds her alone on the stage of the MGM Grand. At 77, Cher moves through the opening notes of If I Could Turn Back Time with the same theatrical precision that made her a legend, but something has shifted in the space between the music and the woman. Her voice, that unmistakable instrument that has carried her through 6 decades, still reaches every corner of the arena, yet there's a weight to it now, a knowing. The rhinestones on her gown catch the light like fallen stars, each one hand-sewn by craftsmen who understand that perfection is the only acceptable standard for a woman who has never been allowed the luxury of being merely human. Her movements are deliberate, practiced, the result of thousands of performances where every gesture was choreographed, every breath calculated for maximum impact. She pauses between verses, scanning faces that could be her children, even grandchildren. The crowd spans generations now. Women in their 70s who remember watching the Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour in their living rooms, middle-aged fans who discovered her through Moonstruck, millennials who found her on social media and fell in love with her unapologetic authenticity. They sing along to words written in 1989, but the song has become something else entirely, a meditation on time, on loss, on the terrible beauty of surviving when others couldn't. The costume glitters under the lights, sequined armor against time itself. But in that moment of silence, you can see it, the cost of being the last one standing, of watching an entire era disappear while you remain, performing the same songs that once felt like freedom but now echo with the ghosts of everyone who should be here beside you. Karen Carpenter should be here. Whitney Houston should be here. Prince should be here. Even Sonny, who died on that snowy mountain in 1998, should be here to witness what they built together, what survived long after their partnership crumbled into lawyers and lawsuits. The crowd erupts, but their cheers bounce off something unreachable. She smiles, that practiced professional curve of lips that has hidden a lifetime of battles, and launches into the next song. But to understand how we got here, to this stage where survival itself becomes its own kind of tragedy, we have to go back to the beginning. This is the story of a woman who conquered every medium, who reinvented herself more times than any artist should have to, and who paid a price that few could bear. At 77, Cher stands as the ultimate survivor in an industry that devours its young. But survival, as we'll see, can be its own form of heartbreak. She's outlived the music that made her famous, outlasted the industry that tried to control her, and watched the world change around her so completely that she's become a living artifact of dreams Americans used to dream. If this story moves you, tap like so others find it, because some legends deserve to be understood, not just celebrated. She was born Sherilyn Sarkeesian on May 20th, 1946, in El Centro, California, a nowhere town where the heat shimmers off endless highways leading somewhere else. The hospital was small, understaffed, the kind of place where dreams went to die in rooms that smelled of disinfectant and broken promises. Her mother, Georgia Holt, was 19, blonde and drowning in dreams too big for a desert town. Her father, John Sarkeesian, was an Armenian-American truck driver with a gambling problem and a tendency to vanish when responsibility knocked. Georgia had named her daughter after Lana Turner's character in a movie she'd seen, imagining a life of glamour that seemed as distant as the stars. But reality was a cramped apartment above a diner, where the jukebox played the same songs over and over until they became the soundtrack to disappointment. By the time Cher was 2, her father was gone for good, not just absent, but erased, as if he'd never existed at all. By the time she was 5, her mother had married and divorced twice more. The pattern was set. Men who promised stability, who delivered chaos, who left Georgia to pick up the pieces with a little girl who learned early that love was temporary and home was wherever they could afford rent. Each new stepfather brought his own rules, his own version of what a family should look like. Roy Crouch lasted the longest, 3 years, and treated Cher with a kindness that made his eventual departure even more devastating. He was the one who taught her to play piano, who listened when she sang along to the radio, who made her believe that maybe she was worth staying for. When he left, taking his gentle presence and leaving only the echo of piano lessons, Cher learned not to get attached to father figures. The moves came in waves. 11 schools before she turned 16, Los Angeles to New York to wherever Georgia's latest husband's job took them, or wherever they fled when the money ran out. Each relocation required a new Cher. Quiet Cher for the strict schools, tough Cher for the rough neighborhoods, invisible Cher when the family dynamics became too complicated to navigate. She learned to pack light, to not get attached to bedrooms or friends or the idea that tomorrow would look like today. Her few possessions fit in a single suitcase: a few dresses, some photos, and a diary where she wrote songs that sounded like prayers for a different life. At Fresno High School, she was the weird kid, tall, gangly, with a nose she thought was too big and teeth that needed fixing they couldn't afford. Dyslexia made reading a nightmare, letters swimming on pages like they were mocking her attempts to understand. Teachers grew frustrated with her inability to keep up, labeling her lazy or stupid without bothering to understand that her brain simply worked differently. But dyslexia sharpened other senses. She could read a room, read people, read the distance between what they said and what they meant. She understood tone, inflection, the way a person's posture changed when they lied. These were survival skills in a world that never stopped moving, never offered the luxury of stability long enough to put down roots. The only constant was her mother's voice, floating from whatever kitchen they currently called home, singing along to the radio. Georgia had talent, real talent, but she'd traded it for security that never came. She'd been offered recording contracts in her 20s, had managers interested in her look, her sound. But each time opportunity knocked, there was a man promising something easier, something safer. Marriage instead of music, motherhood instead of stardom. Late at night, when she thought Cher was asleep, Georgia would sit at the piano and play songs that sounded like prayers for a different life. Her voice would crack on certain notes, not from lack of ability, but from the weight of wondering what might have been. Those midnight concerts taught Cher something crucial. Talent without courage was just another form of imprisonment. It was in one of those dimly lit moments, listening to her mother sing to an audience of empty rooms, that Cher made her first promise to herself. She would never be trapped by other people's choices. She would never sing in empty rooms, dreaming of stages she'd never see. She would make it out, no matter what it cost. The plan crystallized during her sophomore year. She was failing most classes, fighting with teachers who couldn't understand why she struggled with basic reading assignments. Her guidance counselor suggested vocational training, maybe secretarial work, something practical for a girl with limited options. At 16, she convinced her mother to let her drop out of school and move to Los Angeles. The official plan was acting lessons, maybe modeling. The reality was a series of dead-end jobs and auditions that led nowhere. She was a go-go dancer at clubs where the music was too loud and the men too eager. She worked as a backup singer for recording sessions, her distinctive voice buried in choruses behind artists who had the connections she lacked. She rented a tiny apartment in Hollywood, sharing it with other aspiring performers who survived on coffee and hope. The refrigerator was usually empty, but the dreams were full. Sprawling, impossible visions of fame that seemed to grow larger in inverse proportion to their bank accounts. And then, one night at a coffee shop on Sunset Boulevard, someone did notice. Someone who would change everything, though not in the way she'd imagined. Sonny Bono was 27, 11 years older, and everything Cher wasn't. Short, confident, connected. He wore expensive clothes and drove a nice car, spoke casually about working with Phil Spector like it was nothing special. He lived in a world where music mattered, where people made records that changed lives, where talent was currency and connections were power. When he offered to let her crash at his place, platonically, he assured her, just until she found something permanent, it felt like the first real kindness she'd ever received from a man. His apartment was modest but stable, filled with records and instruments and the kind of creative energy she'd been seeking her entire life. The platonic arrangement lasted 3 weeks. On a Tuesday night in November 1962, over takeout Chinese food and wine that made her feel sophisticated, Sonny kissed her. It wasn't romantic exactly, more like a business decision that happened to involve hearts and bodies. He needed someone to mold, someone to believe in his vision. She needed someone to believe in her at all. Sonny didn't just become her boyfriend, he became her architect. He saw something in the gangly girl with the unusual voice, not just talent, but malleability. She was unformed enough to be shaped, desperate enough to be grateful, young enough to mistake control for love. He could craft her into exactly what he needed, the perfect partner for his own ambitions. First, they were Caesar and Cleo, a duo that sounded more important than they were. They recorded at Gold Star Studios, where Phil Spector was creating his wall of sound, and their early tracks disappeared into the machinery of the music business without making a ripple. But Sonny was persistent, adjusting their image, refining their sound, searching for the combination that would unlock success. The breakthrough came with the song Sonny wrote in 20 minutes. I Got You, Babe. It was simple, almost naive, a conversation between lovers who had nothing but each other and somehow found that enough. When it hit #1 in August 1965, Cher was 19, Sonny was 30. The song was sweet, innocent, a promise of eternal devotion that masked a relationship built on control. Success transformed them overnight. Suddenly, they were Sonny and Cher, a brand as much as a couple, their personal relationship inseparable from their professional partnership. Their look, his mod suits, her long hair and peasant dresses, defined an era. Their sound dominated radio. Their faces appeared on magazine covers around the world. But while America fell in love with their hippie-chic image, Sonny was negotiating contracts that gave him everything: publishing rights, management fees, creative control, even ownership of the name Cher as a recording artist. She received a weekly allowance of $300, like an employee rather than a partner, while their empire generated millions. The music industry of the 1960s was still a boys' club where women were expected to look pretty, sing sweetly, and let the men handle the business. Sonny understood this dynamic perfectly and used it to his advantage. He presented himself as Cher's Svengali, the genius behind her success, while she played the role of the talented but naive girl who needed his guidance. Their albums sold millions. Look at Us, The Wondrous World of Sonny and Cher, In Case You're In, Love. Each release cemented their status as America's sweethearts, but also deepened Cher's dependence on Sonny's vision. She contributed ideas, suggested arrangements, wrote melodies that became integral to their sound. But contractually, none of it belonged to her. The television variety show that made them household names began in 1971. The Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour was appointment television, drawing 30 million viewers each week. America loved their banter, their elaborate Bob Mackie costumes, their seemingly effortless chemistry. The show won Emmy nominations and turned them into icons of American entertainment. What audiences didn't see were the 18-hour days, the grueling rehearsal schedules, or the way Sonny monitored every aspect of Cher's life. He controlled her friendships, screening phone calls and deciding who was allowed into their inner circle. He managed her finances, doling out money for personal expenses while building an empire in his name. He even dictated her conversations during interviews, coaching her on which stories to tell and which subjects to avoid. The costumes became more elaborate, more restrictive. Bob Mackie's creations transformed Cher into a living work of art, but art requires immobility. She learned to move carefully in 15-pound beaded gowns, to breathe shallowly in corsets that cinched her waist to impossible dimensions, to never let the audience see the pins and padding that held everything together. Each public appearance was choreographed, every gesture calculated. The spontaneous moments that audiences treasured, the playful insults, the affectionate touches, the knowing glances, were rehearsed as carefully as the musical numbers. Their love story had become performance art, and the line between reality and show business had dissolved completely. Success brought new pressures that neither had anticipated. The press dissected every outfit, every hairstyle, every public appearance with microscopic intensity. When Cher gained 5 pounds, the tabloids called her fat. When she lost 10, they said she was too thin, speculating about eating disorders and drug problems. When she smiled, she was trying too hard. When she didn't, she was ungrateful for her success. The girl who had learned to disappear now lived under a microscope, every flaw magnified and monetized. Paparazzi followed them to restaurants, grocery stores, even their daughters' school events. Privacy became a luxury they couldn't afford, normalcy an impossibility. But then, as the 1960s ended and musical tastes shifted, their career hit a wall. The counterculture was growing darker, more political. Songs about love and togetherness seemed naive in a world torn apart by the Vietnam War and the civil rights struggles. Rock music was becoming harder, more aggressive, while pop was fragmenting into dozens of subgenres. Their 1969 album, The Beat Goes On, failed to produce a hit single. Radio stations weren't sure how to categorize their music anymore. Too pop for the emerging rock stations, too rock for the adult contemporary format, too old-fashioned for the teenagers who were discovering heavier sounds. The pressure intensified. Touring became a necessity rather than a choice, and not the triumphant arena tours of their peak years. They played smaller venues, county fairs, casino lounges, dinner theaters, to audiences who remembered them fondly but weren't necessarily buying their new records. Sonny began making increasingly desperate creative choices, chasing trends they were too established to embody authentically. He wanted to record protest songs, psychedelic experiments, anything that might recapture their relevance. The costumes grew more outrageous, the performances more frantic, as if spectacle could substitute for the organic chemistry that had once made them special. Cher began to see the golden cage Sonny had built around them, around her. She wanted to record solo albums, to explore the deeper, more soulful side of her voice. Sonny refused, insisting that their strength was their partnership. She suggested different producers, new musical directions. He dismissed her ideas as naive, reminding her that he was the one with the industry connections and business experience. Most painfully, she wanted to manage her own money, to understand the empire built on her voice and image. When she asked to see their financial records, Sonny's response was always the same. "Don't worry about that stuff. That's my job. You just focus on performing." The breaking point came during a recording session in 1972. They were working on what would become their final album together, All I Ever Need Is You, trying to recapture the magic that felt increasingly elusive. The studio sessions had grown tense, filled with arguments about arrangements, lyrics, even which songs to record. Cher suggested a different approach to the title track, something more soulful and less produced. Sonny cut her off mid-sentence, turned to the producer and said, "She's just the singer. Let's stick to what works." The words hung in the air like smoke from a cigarette burned down to nothing. She's just the singer. After 7 years of partnership, after selling millions of records, after building an entertainment empire together, that's how he saw her, as an employee, assistant, an instrument he could play when needed. That night, alone in their Holmby Hills mansion while Sonny worked late at the office, Cher realized she had become exactly what she'd sworn she'd never be, trapped by someone else's choices, singing other people's songs in rooms that felt like prisons. The scared girl from Fresno was still there, still waiting to be saved, still hoping someone else would solve her problems. But at 26, she was no longer that girl. She was a woman with a daughter, a career, and a growing understanding that sometimes salvation meant saving yourself. The marriage began to crumble in public view, their private, battles bleeding through the carefully constructed facade. Their on-stage chemistry, once genuine and spontaneous, became pure performance. The playful insults that audiences loved turned sharp, personal, each joke a small act of revenge for perceived slights. During tapings of their variety show, Sonny would mock her intelligence in front of the studio audience, making jokes about her lack of education or her difficulty reading scripts. Cher would respond with withering put-downs about his height, his age, his increasingly desperate attempts to stay relevant. What had once been loving teasing between partners became psychological warfare conducted in sequins and spotlights. Behind the scenes, the battles were worse. Every creative decision became a power struggle. Every financial discussion ended in accusations. Cher wanted artistic freedom. Sonny wanted control. She wanted respect. He wanted submission. They were fighting over the same thing they'd always fought over: who owned Cher's talent, her voice, her very identity as a performer. The revelation that broke everything came when Cher finally hired her own lawyer to review their business arrangements. What she discovered was worse than she'd imagined. Sonny controlled every aspect of their entertainment empire: the production company, the music publishing, the television show, even the rights to her own name as a performer. She was technically an employee of Cher Enterprises, a company that owned everything about her career except her actual participation in it. The contracts were airtight, written by entertainment lawyers who understood how to protect their clients' interests. Sonny owned her past, the master recordings of every song they'd made together. He owned her present, the television show that was their primary source of income. He owned her future. Any solo recording contract would require his approval. Any concert appearances would pay fees to his management company. When Cher finally filed for divorce in February 1974, she discovered the true depth of her imprisonment. She was worth millions on paper but had no access to her own money, no control over her own career, no legal right to perform the songs that had made her famous. The legal battle stretched for months. Sonny fought every request, contested every claim. He wanted custody of their daughter, Chastity. He wanted to keep the business intact. He wanted her to disappear as completely as her father had, 30 years earlier, leaving him with the empire they'd built together. The courtroom was small, beige, nothing like the stages where she'd spent the last decade performing her life for audiences who cheered every entrance and exit. On March 4, 1975, Judge George H. Dell granted Cher's divorce and, more crucially, her freedom from the contracts that had bound her to Sonny's management company. The ruling was devastating in its implications. Judge Dell stated that Sonny had exercised undue influence over her career and finances, legal terminology for what Cher had lived every day for 11 years. The contracts that made her an employee of her own success were declared unconscionable, a word that carried the weight of professional humiliation and personal betrayal. But freedom came with a price that no one had calculated. While the court could dissolve the contracts, it couldn't restore the years of earnings that had been structured around Sonny's control. The master recordings, the publishing rights, the business relationships that generated ongoing revenue, all of that remained with him. Walking out of that courthouse, Cher faced a devastating reality. She was 30 years old, a single mother, and despite selling over 40 million records, she was essentially broke. The mansion was gone, sold to pay legal fees. The cars, the jewelry, the costumes, everything that had represented their success now belonged to someone else. That night, alone in her rented apartment in West Hollywood, a far cry from the Hollywood Hills mansion she'd called home for nearly a decade, Cher sat at a rented piano and tried to remember the last time she'd chosen her own song. The silence was different from the quiet moments between sets or the pause before an encore. This was the silence of starting over, of being nobody again, of having to prove herself to an industry that had already moved on to newer, younger talents. The apartment was sparse, temporary, furnished with the kind of pieces that came with month-to-month leases. No gold records on the walls, no Emmys on the shelves, no evidence that she'd ever been anyone important. Just a woman with a distinctive voice and a growing understanding that talent without leverage was just another form of entertainment. Freedom, she discovered, was another word for nothing left to lose. Without Sonny's guiding hand and industry connections, the music business didn't know what to do with her. She was too pop for the emerging rock scene, too rock for the established pop radio formats, too old for the teenage market that drove record sales, too young for the adult contemporary crowd that didn't take her seriously anyway. Her first solo album, Stars, released in 1975, was an artistic statement that the marketplace ignored. Produced by Jimmy Webb, it showcased her voice in ways her duet career never had, more soulful, more vulnerable, more emotionally complex. Critics praised her vocal growth, but praise didn't translate to sales. The album peaked at number 153 on the Billboard charts, a commercial disaster that sent a clear message. Cher without Sonny was damaged goods. Radio stations weren't sure which format to place her in. Her music was too sophisticated for top 40, too pop for the album-oriented rock stations that were defining musical taste for the generation that should have been her core audience. Program directors remembered her as half of a variety show duo, not as a serious solo artist deserving of airplay. The variety show that had made her famous was canceled within months of the divorce, despite winning an Emmy Award. Network executives claimed declining ratings, but industry insiders knew the truth. Controversy was bad for business, and a bitter divorce between America's sweethearts was the wrong kind of publicity for a family-friendly program. Cher, who had never been without work since she was 19, found herself auditioning again. But these weren't the hopeful auditions of her teenage years. These were desperate attempts to prove she still existed as a viable entertainer. She auditioned for Broadway shows, television guest spots, even commercial endorsements. Each rejection felt like a confirmation of what Sonny had always implied. Without him, she was nothing. She threw herself into relationships with the same intensity she once reserved for performances, seeking in personal connection what she'd lost professionally. Greg Allman, the troubled Allman Brothers guitarist whose cocaine addiction matched her own desperate need to feel something other than professional humiliation, became her refuge from reality. Their romance was tabloid gold, the wholesome variety show star and the southern rock bad boy, opposites who attracted each other like magnets drawn to destruction. They married after knowing each other for 9 days, divorced after 9 days when she discovered the extent of his drug problem, remarried when he promised to get clean, and divorced again when the promises proved empty. The entire chaotic cycle played out in the gossip columns, each reconciliation and separation providing fresh material for writers who portrayed her as unstable, desperate, a woman who couldn't make good decisions about men. The relationships that followed were similarly intense and ultimately damaging. She was searching for something, validation, security, distraction, in connections that couldn't bear the weight of her needs. Each failed romance became evidence of her inability to maintain stable relationships, fuel for critics who suggested that her problems went deeper than professional disappointment. The substances came next, though she was careful to avoid the hard drugs that were claiming so many of her contemporaries. Prescription pills promised numbness, softening the edges of failure and rejection. Alcohol made social situations bearable, gave her courage to face rooms full of people who remembered when she mattered. She was always professional when work came, never missing performances, never obviously impaired, but the work came less frequently. Her 1977 album, Cherished, performed even worse than Stars, barely registering on the charts despite featuring songs written by established hitmakers. The industry whispered that she was finished, that her moment had passed, that she should accept her role as a nostalgia act and be grateful for whatever opportunities remained. The breaking point came in 1978, during a particularly dark period when work had dried up entirely and her latest relationship had ended badly. Alone in her Las Vegas hotel room after performing at a small casino to a half-empty crowd, she stood on the balcony calculating whether the fall would be enough. The thought lasted only minutes, but it was long enough to scare her into calling for help. The official story was an accidental overdose, a mixing of prescription medications and alcohol that resulted in a brief hospitalization. But years later, she would admit the truth. She had seriously considered ending her life, had come closer than anyone knew to giving up entirely. The aftermath was worse than the act itself. The story leaked, as stories always did in an industry where privacy was a commodity to be bought and sold. The press painted her as unstable, unreliable, a has-been whose problems had spiraled out of control. Insurance companies refused to bond her for major productions, effectively blacklisting her from significant roles. She was damaged goods in an industry that worshipped youth and punished vulnerability. She took whatever work came: dinner theater productions where her name still drew audiences hungry for nostalgia, casino lounges where she performed for crowds more interested in gambling than entertainment, guest spots on other people's television shows where she played versions of herself for laughs that felt increasingly hollow. The costumes were still elaborate. She couldn't abandon the visual spectacle that had always been part of her appeal, but something essential had died in that courthouse, something that no amount of sequins could resurrect. The belief that she could control her own destiny, that talent combined with determination would be enough, had been replaced by a grim understanding of how the entertainment industry actually worked. Acting became her lifeline, though it wasn't a conscious career choice so much as an act of desperation disguised as artistic growth. In 1982, she took a small role in Robert Altman's Come Back to the Five and Dime Jimmy Dean, a film adaptation of a play she'd done off-Broadway the year before. The part was thankless, the pay minimal, scale plus 10%, but it reminded her of something she'd forgotten. She could inhabit other people's lives, escape her own story for a few hours at a time. Acting offered the possibility of reinvention, of being judged on performance rather than personal history. The off-Broadway run had been a revelation. Working with serious actors, taking direction from respected directors, being treated as an artist rather than a celebrity, it awakened something that had been dormant since her variety show days. The discipline required was different from musical performance but equally demanding, and she discovered she had both the instinct and the work ethic to excel. Director Mike Nichols saw her performance in the Altman film and took a chance on her for Silkwood, the 1983 drama starring Meryl Streep. The role of Dolly Pellicker, a lesbian factory worker and loyal friend to Streep's Karen Silkwood, was small but significant, a supporting character with depth and complexity that allowed Cher to demonstrate acting ability beyond mere star power. Working with Meryl Streep was intimidating but educational. Streep treated her as a peer, offering advice without condescension, helping her navigate scenes without overshadowing her performance. The experience taught Cher about the craft of acting, the preparation required, the emotional honesty demanded, the way a skilled performer could find truth in fictional circumstances. Her performance earned critical praise and, more importantly, her first Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress. Suddenly, the industry that had dismissed her as a pop culture relic began to see her as a serious actress with untapped potential. But success in film brought its own pressures and limitations. She was typecast almost immediately as the tough broad, the working-class survivor, the woman who'd seen too much and lived to tell about it. Studios wanted her to play versions of her public persona: the trailer park girl made good, the survivor with a heart of gold, the woman who could deliver a punchline and a punch with equal effectiveness. The roles that came her way, Mask, 1985, Suspect, 1987, were variations on the same theme: strong women dealing with difficult circumstances, characters defined by their resilience rather than their vulnerabilities. Even when she was acting, she couldn't escape the narrative that had been constructed around her public image. The 1987 film Moonstruck changed everything, though she almost didn't take the role. The script about a widow who finds unexpected love seemed too light, too romantic after the heavy dramas that had established her acting credibility. But director Norman Jewison convinced her that the character of Loretta Castorini was more complex than she appeared, a woman learning to embrace passion after years of playing it safe. The performance required her to access parts of herself she'd kept hidden during her variety show years: vulnerability, genuine emotion, the kind of romantic yearning that couldn't be choreographed or rehearsed. Working opposite Nicolas Cage, she discovered a chemistry that felt both professional and deeply personal, as if the role had unlocked aspects of her personality that fame had forced into hiding. The film was a massive commercial and critical success, grossing over $80 million and earning her the Academy Award for Best Actress. At 41, she had achieved what many thought impossible: complete reinvention as a legitimate dramatic performer, acceptance by an industry that had written her off as yesterday's news. Standing on that Oscar stage on March 30th, 1988, holding the golden statue and looking out at an audience of her peers, Cher thanked her makeup artist, her hairdresser, her agent, her costumer, everyone except the man, who had once owned her career, her voice, her very name. The omission was deliberate, a final declaration of independence from the partnership that had made her famous and nearly destroyed her in the process. At 77, Cher has outlived most of her contemporaries, a fact that brings both pride and profound loneliness. The list of the departed reads like a roll call of American popular culture. Sunny died in a skiing accident in 1998, having reconciled with her years earlier through their shared love for their daughter. Karen Carpenter succumbed to anorexia at 32. Whitney Houston drowned in a bathtub at 48, prescription drugs in her system. Prince collapsed in an elevator at 57. David Bowie, her contemporary and occasional collaborator, died at 69 after an 18-month battle with cancer he kept private until the end. Each death feels personal, not just because she knew many of these artists personally, but because they represent the gradual erasure of the world that made her. The music industry of the 1960s and 1970s was intimate in ways that seem impossible now. Everyone knew everyone. Careers were built on relationships as much as talent, and the machinery of fame operated on a human scale. She still tours, though less frequently now, and with a different awareness of time's passage. The Living Proof, the farewell tour, that began in 2002 was supposed to be exactly that, a final goodbye to live performance. But farewell became a relative term, as she found herself unable to completely abandon the stage that had been her home for 60 years. Her current shows are spectacles that span decades of popular music, costume changes that chronicle the evolution of fashion and taste. She performs gypsies, tramps, and thieves in a Bob Mackie creation that recreates the glamour of 1971, then changes into contemporary designs that prove she can still command attention through sheer force of personality. The costumes are still spectacular, some weighing over 30 pounds, covered in crystals that catch the light like captured stars, but there's a poignancy to them now, armor against time that protects everything except the passage of years. The performances themselves have evolved to accommodate her age while maintaining their essential power. She can't dance with the same athletic intensity that once defined her shows, but her stage presence has grown more commanding with age. Every movement is purposeful, every gesture weighted with decades of experience. When she sings Believe, the 1998 dance anthem that introduced her to a new generation through auto-tuned vocals, she transforms it from a disco celebration into something approaching a spiritual anthem. Her personal life has found a quieter rhythm after decades of public romance and private heartbreak. She's a grandmother now, devoted to her family in ways that fame once made impossible. Her relationship with her son Chaz, who transitioned from female to male in his 40s, weathered the adjustment with grace and fierce maternal protection. When Chaz faced public scrutiny for his transition, Cher's response was immediate and unwavering. "If you have a problem with my son, you have a problem with me." The transformation challenged her in ways that performing never had, forcing her to examine assumptions about gender and identity that she'd never questioned, learning new vocabulary and concepts that didn't exist when she was raising her daughter Chastity. But her love proved stronger than her confusion, and she became an advocate for transgender rights with the same passion she'd once brought to her performances. She's learned to choose love over image, privacy over publicity. Her romantic relationships, most notably with motorcycle enthusiast and entrepreneur Ron Zimmerman, unfold away from paparazzi cameras. At an age when many people become invisible, she's discovered the luxury of ordinary moments: grocery shopping, walking her dogs, sitting in her Malibu garden watching the ocean change colors with the light. But the price of longevity in show business reveals itself in unexpected ways. She's worth hundreds of millions now. The fortune that eluded her for so long finally materialized through smart investments, catalog ownership, and the compounding value of a career that spans generations. Yet money can't buy back the decades spent fighting for respect, can't restore the relationships sacrificed to ambition, can't erase the nights spent wondering if survival was worth the cost. The industry that once dismissed her now treats her as royalty, a living link to an era most current executives only know through documentaries. Young artists seek her approval, her collaboration, her blessing. Taylor Swift, Madonna, Lady Gaga. All acknowledge her influence, but their careers unfold in a landscape so different from the one she navigated that their challenges seem almost quaint by comparison. They see the sequins and the sass, the comeback stories and the reinventions, but they can't see the scars, the way she still hesitates before signing contracts, still reads every clause herself, still remembers what it felt like to discover you owned nothing of your own success. The girl who learned not to trust love learned even more thoroughly not to trust the machinery of fame. Her voice has changed with age, grown richer in some ways, more fragile in others. The 5-octave range that made her famous has narrowed to perhaps 3 octaves on a good day, but what remains carries deeper weight. When she sings, "If I Could Turn Back Time Now," it's not just a pop song about romantic regret, it's a conversation with all the selves she used to be, all the choices she wishes she could remake, all the people she's loved who can't hear her anymore. There's a particular loneliness that comes with being the survivor, the one who kept going when others couldn't or wouldn't. Cher has watched entire musical movements rise and fall, disco, punk, new wave, grunge, hip-hop, from the perspective of someone who predates them all. She's seen the industry transform from an intimate world where handshake deals meant something to a corporate machine that manufactures disposable celebrities. She remembers when artists had careers that spanned decades rather than digital cycles, when albums were cultural events rather than playlist fodder, when concerts were communions between performers and audiences rather than branded experiences designed for social media consumption. The changes aren't necessarily bad, but they're total, leaving her feeling like an artifact from a lost civilization. The young performers she encounters now burn through their moment in the spotlight with Instagram intensity, accumulating followers and streams but often lacking the foundational skills that sustained careers in earlier eras. Many can't read music, rely entirely on collaborators for songwriting, and seem unprepared for the psychological demands of sustained fame. She tries to mentor when possible, offering advice that must sound impossibly old-fashioned to artists who measure success in viral moments rather than album sales. The idea of apprenticeship, of learning craft through years of small venues and gradual skill building, seems quaint in an era where one TikTok video can create overnight sensations. The tragedy isn't that Cher is old. Aging is the natural order of things, and she's managed it with more grace than most public figures. The tragedy is that she's still here when so many others aren't, still creating when the world assumes she should be resting, still fighting for relevance in a culture that worships novelty above all else. She's become a living museum of American entertainment, carrying the weight of an entire era on shoulders that were never designed for such a burden. Every interview becomes an exercise in nostalgia, every public appearance an opportunity for journalists to relitigate decades-old controversies or ask her to comment on the current state of show business from the perspective of someone who's supposedly past her prime. Yet she continues because stopping would feel like death itself. At 77, she's planning new tour dates, considering film and television projects, and mentoring young artists who remind her of the girl she once was, hungry, desperate, willing to pay any price for a chance to matter. The work keeps her connected to something larger than herself, to the audience that has followed her through every reinvention and transformation. When she steps onto a stage and hears thousands of voices singing along to songs she wrote 50 years ago, the loneliness retreats, temporarily replaced by the communion that made her choose this life in the first place. The spotlight fades, but she remains on the empty stage for a moment longer than necessary. The crowd has gone home, the musicians have packed their instruments, the crew is already breaking down the elaborate set pieces that transformed this generic arena into her personal theater. But Cher stands alone in the darkness, listening to the echo of applause that's been the soundtrack to her life for 60 years. Her feet hurt in the platform shoes that add inches to her already impressive height. The costume, magnificent under the lights, feels heavy now, crystals and beading that catch no reflection in the darkness. She can hear the distant sounds of the crew loading equipment, the mundane business of entertainment that continues long after the magic ends. Tomorrow there will be another city, another stage, another crowd hungry for the magic she's somehow never stopped believing in. The costumes will glitter, the songs will soar, and for 2 hours she'll transform a building full of strangers into believers in the power of pure, unapologetic survival. But tonight, in the quiet after the storm, she's just a woman who fought every battle life could throw at her and somehow came out the other side still singing. The scared girl from El Centro is still there somewhere, still amazed that people pay money to hear her voice, still grateful for every moment under the lights. The tragedy of Cher isn't that she's 77 and still working. It's that she had to become legendary just to claim ownership of her own voice. It's that she survived an industry designed to consume young women and leave nothing behind but memories and greatest hits compilations. It's that she's still here, still fighting, still proving herself to a world that seems constantly surprised by her refusal to disappear gracefully. She takes one last look around the empty arena, memorizing this moment like all the others, not because she thinks it will be her last, but because she's learned that nothing in this business is permanent except the music itself. Walking toward the exit, she passes a security guard who nods respectfully. "Great show, Ms. Cher," he says, and she smiles, not the practiced professional smile of her performances, but something smaller, more genuine. "Thank you," she replies, and means it. After all these years, the gratitude is still real. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to understand what real strength looks like. And tell me in the comments, which moment in Cher's journey hit you the hardest? The young girl learning to disappear, the trapped wife discovering her cage, the broken woman rebuilding herself piece by piece, or the survivor standing alone on that stage, carrying the weight of an entire era. Some legends are born, others are forged in fires hot enough to consume lesser souls. Cher chose to burn bright rather than fade away, and 60 years later, the light still reaches us from here.